Sir, you can't treat him like that in my diner. If you don't have proof, you should leave him alone.
Thank you. And tomorrow, you'll understand exactly who you stood up for.
Sir, you can't treat him like that in my diner. If you don't have proof, you should leave him alone. The words rang out sharper than the clink of silverware and the low hum of morning chatter. They cut clean through the room, landing with a firmness that surprised even the woman who spoke them. Mara didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She stood behind the counter, coffee pot still in her hand, shoulders squared beneath a faded yellow apron that read "Sunny Side Up" in curling red letters. She had tied her dark hair back in a loose ponytail at the start of her shift, though a few stubborn strands had escaped and now framed her face. There was a small smear of flour on her cheek from the morning rush, and her sneakers squeaked faintly against the tiled floor as she shifted her weight. Across the diner, one of the police officers froze, his hand hovering inches from the table. Where the man sat alone in a corner booth, the man in question hadn't moved at all. He sat straight-backed, hands folded loosely on the table, untouched eggs cooling in front of him. He looked neither afraid nor angry, only patient, as if this interruption were an inconvenience he had anticipated. His eyes, dark and steady, lifted from the tabletop to meet Mara's. The officer turned slowly toward her. He was broad-shouldered, red-faced, and clearly not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a waitress half his size. "Man," he said, drawing the word out as though explaining something to a child. "This doesn't concern you." "It does when it happens here," Mara replied. Her voice didn't waver. "You've got no warrant, no explanation, and no reason to scare my customers." A ripple of unease moved through the diner. Coffee cups hovered halfway to lips. Forks paused mid. A trucker near the window shifted on his stool, suddenly very interested in the condensation on his glass. Even the old ceiling fan above them, a relic from another decade, seemed to slow its rhythmic clacking, its loose blade ticking as if listening. The second officer, thinner and younger, glanced between his partner and Mara, uncertainty flickering across his face. "We're just asking a few questions," he muttered. "You've been asking them for 10 minutes, Mara said, "and you're not getting answers because you don't have a reason to." The first officer scoffed. "You don't know who this guy is?" "That's right," she said, "and neither do you, apparently." Silence settled heavily over the room. Then the man in the booth finally spoke. "Officer," he said calmly, turning his gaze back to the policeman, "I believe the lady has made herself quite clear." His voice was quiet, even it carried. It wasn't loudness that commanded attention. It was certainty. The officer bristled. "You threatening me?" The man's lips curved. "Just barely, no." The pause stretched. "But," he added, lifting his eyes toward Mara once more, "thank you." He stood then, smooth and unhurried, and looked directly at her. Then he spoke again. It was to her alone. "Tomorrow," he said, his gaze calm but intense, "you'll understand exactly who you stood up for." Something in his tone sent a chill through her, not fear, exactly, but awareness, as though a door had cracked open somewhere, letting in a draft from a much larger world. The officers exchanged looks. The younger one cleared his throat. "Let's go," he said quietly. The older officer hesitated, pride warring with instinct. Finally, he muttered something under his breath. "Just doing our job," and jerked his head toward the door. The bell chimed sharply as they left, the cold morning air rushing in behind them like an exhale. The door swung shut, and the sound echoed louder than it should have for a moment. No one spoke. Then the ceiling fan resumed its clatter. Someone laughed too loudly. Conversation crept back in, cautious and disjointed, as though the diner itself was shaking off a bad dream. Mara set the coffee pot down with a soft clink and realized her hands were trembling. She hadn't noticed how tight her shoulders were until she consciously forced herself to relax them. A slow breath left her lungs. She turned back toward the booth. The man was still standing, buttoning his coat. He was dressed neatly but without flash dark slacks, a charcoal jacket worn at the cuffs, no watch, no visible jewelry. There was nothing about him that screamed money or power, yet the space around him felt heavier, as though he bent the room slightly just by occupying it. "Sorry about that," Mara said, grabbing a mug and refilling his coffee out of habit. "I don't like bullies. Badge or no badge." She slid the cup toward him. Her fingers brushed the ceramic, grounding her. He regarded her for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her feel oddly transparent. "That quality," he said at last, "is rarer than you think." She snorted softly and shrugged. "Yeah, well, guess that's what happens when you grow up here. You learn when to stand your ground." "Did anyone teach you that?" he asked. "Life did," she replied. "Mostly the corner of his mouth." "Lifted you passing through town?" she asked, suddenly eager to fill the silence. "For now," he said, glancing around the diner as if committing it to memory of the cracked vinyl booths, the crooked menu board, the faint smell of grease, and burnt toast. "Places like this matter more than people realize." She laughed. "Trust me, this place barely matters to the health inspector." "Even so," he said thoughtfully, "it's often where the most important choices are made. Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket, withdrew a folded bill, and placed it beneath his coffee cup. The edge of it caught her eye too thick to be a 5 or a 10. "You don't?" she began. "I do," he said gently. He met her gaze one last time. "Thank you again. I hope tomorrow is kind to you." Then he turned and walked toward the door. The bell chimed. The morning swallowed him whole. Mara stared after him longer than she meant to. When she finally lifted the cup, her breath caught. The bill beneath it was far more than the meal had cost, more than she made in a shift on most days. "What the hell?" she murmured. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine. Orders taken, plates cleared, coffee refilled. Regulars asked. What questions she brushed off with half smiles and vague answers. By afternoon, the incident already felt unreal. Like a story she'd heard rather than something she'd lived up by closing time. Exhaustion settled deep in her bones. She wiped down the counter, stacked chairs, and flipped the sign on the door from open to closed. Outside, the town lay quiet beneath a pale sky, street lights flickering to life one by one. "You're over it," she told herself. She was just a waitress in a forgotten town. He was just another customer passing through. Still, as she locked the door and stepped into the cool night air, that strange feeling returned, the one she couldn't name, the one tugging at her chest like a held breath. "Tomorrow, you'll understand," the words echoed again, louder now, somewhere beyond the darkened streets and sleeping houses. Something had shifted, and it had all started the moment she chose to speak up. The next morning began like any other. The sun crept up over the horizon in a washed-out yellow, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot behind the diner. A thin layer of frost clung stubbornly to windshields, sparkling briefly, before surrendering to daylight. Somewhere down the road, a semi groaned to life. The town yawned and stretched, reluctant but obedient. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee, bacon grease, and yesterday's pie. Comforting, familiar, unremarkable. Mara tied her apron at the waist, tugging the knot tight. Sunny Side Up smiled back at her in peeling red letters. She poured the first pot of coffee, flipped on the griddle, and slid seamlessly into routine. Order pad stacked, mugs lined up. The rhythm of small-town mornings settled in her bones. Truckers claimed their usual stools. Retirees gathered at the corner table, arguing softly about weather and politics. Locals wandered in like they always did, greeting one another as if no wall separated their homes from this place. Mara told herself firmly that yesterday had been nothing more than an odd moment stretched too thin by her imagination. He stood up to a couple of pushy cops, she thought. That's it, happens everywhere. And yet, as she poured coffee for Hank the mechanic, her mind betrayed her. "Tomorrow you'll understand." She shook her head slightly as if that might dislodge the words. By mid-morning, the diner was comfortably full, the kind of full that hummed instead of buzzed. Conversations overlapped, silverware clinked, the old ceiling fan ticked along, one blade still threatening to come loose if it ever spun too fast. Then the whisper came, not a sound exactly, more like a disturbance in the air. Mara noticed it when Hank stopped mid-sentence and turned toward the window. "You seeing that?" he muttered. She followed his gaze. A black sedan had pulled into the lot. It was long, low, and immaculate. Its surface, so polished it reflected the diner like a distorted mirror. It rolled to a stop with deliberate precision, tires crunching softly against gravel that had never known a vehicle worth more than a month's rent. Before she could comment, a second sedan followed, then a third. They lined up neatly, like chess pieces placed by an unseen hand. Conversation slowed. Chairs creaked as people leaned toward the windows. Someone near the door let out a low whistle. "Since when does the mayor drive a funeral procession?" A woman whispered. Mara's stomach tightened. That's not normal, she thought. The bell above the door chimed. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped inside. He paused just long enough to scan the room, alert, assessing before moving aside. Then another entered, and another. Men and women, all sharply dressed, all wearing the same quiet awareness in their eyes. They didn't look threatening. They looked prepared. The diner seemed to shrink around them. Then they parted, and the man from yesterday walked in. Daniel, though she didn't know his name, yet looked exactly as he had before. Same understated coat, same calm posture, same sharp, watchful eyes. Panaa, context wrapped around him like gravity. Every suit straightened as he entered. Voices dropped instinctively. Someone actually stood, then sat back down awkwardly, unsure why they'd moved at all. Mara felt the room change before she felt herself change. One of the suited men approached the counter. He was polite, mid-40s maybe, hair touched with gray at the temples. "Miss," he said evenly, "may we reserve the diner for a brief meeting?" Her heart skipped. Reserve the whole diner. A ripple of startled murmurs moved through the room. Before she could process what that would even mean, the man from yesterday raised a hand. "That won't be necessary." The suited man stepped back immediately. Daniel met her eyes. "I told you tomorrow would explain yesterday." The words landed heavier than before. Behind him, one of the suits answered a ringing phone. His posture stiffened as he listened. Color drained from his face. Yes, sir, he said quickly. Understood. He hung up, leaned close to another, and whispered urgently. The whisper spread. Tension threaded through the room like a pulled wire. Mara leaned forward against the counter, lowering her voice. Okay, she said. I'm officially confused. Daniel's expression softened, not faintly this time, warmly. My name is Daniel Cross, he said. I run Cross Global. The effect was immediate. A sharp intake of breath. A mug slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor. Hank's mouth opened and closed without sound. Mara felt the name hit her like cold water. Cross Global, the company whose logo glowed on skyscrapers. The company whose quarterly earnings made headlines. Tech, finance, infrastructure, governance courted them. Markets shifted when Daniel Krause sneezed. Her pulse roared in her ears. You're, she began. Yes, he said gently. That Cross Global. She stared at him, suddenly hyper-aware of the smear of syrup on the counter, the scuff on her shoe, the fact that she was holding a coffee pot like a shield, and the officers yesterday. She asked slowly. They were acting on an anonymous complaint, he said. No evidence, no cause. Her jaw tightened. So that was real, very real, he said. But also intentional. She frowned. Intentional how? Daniel gestured subtly around the diner, the mismatched booths, the chipped mugs, with the people watching in stunned silence. I spend most of my life surrounded by people who know exactly who I am, he said. They behave accordingly, carefully, strategically. His gaze returned to her. I wanted to see how people behaved when they thought power was on their side. The words settled uncomfortably. So this was some kind of test? She asked. He shook his head. Not a test. Then what? A reminder, he said quietly. To myself. Outside. Engines idled. Doors slammed. The distant whir of a helicopter crept into the air. Someone near the window whispered, "Are those news vans?" They were. Camera lenses pressed against glass. Reporters spoke urgently into microphones. The parking lot overflowed now. Luxury cars interspersed with satellite trucks, cables snaking across asphalt that had never hosted anything more exciting than a pothole repair. The diner, forgotten, ignored, invisible, had become the center of something enormous. Mara's hands curled into fists. You let them harass you, she said. On purpose, yes. You scared everyone in here? I regret that, he said sincerely. But I don't regret learning what I did. She searched his face for arrogance. Found none. So what happens now? She asked. Daniel glanced around the room. Now, the officers will be disciplined. Quietly. The complaint will vanish. And this diner will go back to being exactly what it was yesterday. She laughed once, sharp and incredulous. You really think that's possible? His smile returned, small but knowing. Eventually, he reached into his coat and placed a card on the counter, sepal white, his name embossed. Nothing else. You spoke up when you didn't have to, he said. That matters. Her fingers hovered over the card, hesitant. I didn't do it for you, she said. I know, he replied. That's why it mattered. Outside, a reporter shouted a question. Flashbulbs popped out. Daniel turned toward the door, then paused. Tomorrow, he said, echoing his own words. Won't be quiet, but the day after might be. He nodded once, respectfully, and walked out into the storm he'd summoned. Mara stood there long after he was gone. Picard, warm beneath her fingertips. She had wanted yesterday to mean nothing. Instead, it had changed everything. The shock didn't fade, it grew teeth. By noon, the diner was no longer a diner so much as a glass fishbowl under siege. Reporters clustered outside the plate glass windows, cameras flashing in irregular bursts that lit the room like summer lightning. Microphones bobbed above the crowd, their foam heads stamped with logos from networks she'd only ever seen in airport lounges. A helicopter thudded somewhere overhead, close enough to rattle the silverware. Inside, the air had gone, thick and electric. Every conversation competed with every other. Customers whispered and pointed, some openly filming on their phones, others pretending not to stare while very obviously staring. The bell over the door rang constantly as people pushed in and out, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had turned an ordinary Tuesday into a media event. The owner arrived breathless and red-faced, hair half-combed, apron crooked. He took in the scene. Reporters, police cars, edging into the parking lot. Customers waving phones like lighters at a concert and made a small, strangled sound. What happened? He demanded, grabbing her by the elbow. What did you do? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no answer that didn't sound ridiculous. I told a stranger he couldn't talk to me like that. Didn't seem sufficient to explain the chaos now unfolding. Daniel sat at the counter like he belonged there, hands folded neatly in front of him, jacket draped over the stool beside him. He looked less like the epicenter of a storm and more like a man waiting patiently for his check. The noise didn't seem to touch him. He met questions with nods, ignored shouted accusations entirely, and when a cameraman leaned too far into his space, Daniel merely glanced up just once and the man retreated as if he'd brushed against a live wire. "I'll compensate everyone for the disruption," Daniel said calmly, his voice carrying without effort. "Triple the day's earnings, including staff wages and tips." The room went quiet in this strange, collective way a crowd does when it thinks it's misheard something. "Triple?" The owner, CROAKED. Daniel turned slightly on his stool too. "Face him and I'll cover any damages, lost business, or fines incurred today. This should not cost you for someone else's curiosity." The owner stared at him. His knees buckled, just a little. One of the line cooks darted out to steady him. My God," the owner breathed. "Sir," Daniel lifted a hand, gentle but final. "No thanks are necessary." Someone whispered his name. Someone else said it louder. The whisper turned into a murmur, then a ripple, then a wave. Daniel Cross's stomach dropped. We'd needed the name before. Now it landed like a weight in her chest, rearranging everything that had happened that morning. The way he'd listened, the way he hadn't raised his voice, the way the man who tried to bully her had gone pale when Daniel finally stood. She felt suddenly foolish. And exposed, she leaned in toward him, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes," he said evenly, not looking at her. "I did." She frowned. "Because I embarrassed you." "Because you didn't," he replied. Questions flew at him from all directions. "Mr. Cross, is it true you're considering expanding? Can you confirm the rumors about Cross Global's new hub? Why this town?" he answered. Some ignored others and fielded phone calls without breaking his composure. Executives' names flickered across his screen. He silenced most of them. When he did speak into the phone, his tone never changed. Measured, precise, absolute dot between questions. He explained. "Not loudly, not for the cameras. For her. This town is on the short list," he said, as if discussing the weather. "Cross Global is planning a new manufacturing and training hub, sustainable systems. Long-term investment." Her pulse thudded in her ears. Here he nodded. "Thousands of jobs, infrastructure upgrades, scholarships tied to the training, programs, local suppliers prioritized. It would change the economic trajectory of this region for at least a generation." She swallowed. She'd grown up here. She knew exactly what that meant, what could mean. Closed factories, empty stores, kids leaving and never coming back. "And I decide today," he continued, finally turning to look straight at her, "whether this community deserves it." The words landed softly. The impact did not. Her stomach twisted. "Because of me." He studied her for a long moment, dark eyes steady. Then he shook his head once. "Because of values," he corrected. "You showed them without knowing who I was." She thought of the way she'd squared her shoulders, the way she'd said no, without apology, the way she hadn't backed down even when it would have been easier to smile and comply. "I was just doing my job," he said. "Integrity doesn't know when it's being observed," Daniel replied. "That's the point." The police chief arrived shortly after, flanked by two officers who suddenly seemed very interested in the floor tiles. His earlier bluster was gone, replaced by a smile so tight it barely qualified. "Mr. Cross," the chief said, extending a hand, "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. We appreciate your cooperation." Daniel looked at the hand, then at the chief. "He did not take it authority without integrity," Daniel said mildly. "It's just noise." The chief flushed. Cameras surged forward. Someone gasped that, quote, hit the news within minutes by early afternoon. The frenzy reached a fever pitch, and then, strangely, began to burn itself out. Reporters peeled away, rushing to file stories. The helicopter lifted off. The parking lot slowly cleared, leaving behind tire marks and discarded coffee cups like evidence of a passing storm. Inside, the diner felt hollowed out. Quiet rang in her ears. Daniel stood and slipped into his jacket. He looked unchanged still, composed, still distant, but something in his posture softened when he turned back to her. "I'd like you to come to a meeting tomorrow," he said. She blinked. "Tomorrow?" "Yes." She laughed nervously, the sound thin. "I pour coffee. That's kind of my thing. Not as a waitress," he said. "As yourself?" Her laughter faltered. "I don't even know what that means." "Leadership comes in many uniforms," Daniel replied. "Some people wear suits. Some wear aprons. The difference is rarely the clothing." The owner hovered nearby, clearly trying not to eavesdrop and failing spectacularly. She could already see the questions forming, the hope warring with fear. "If I say no," she asked quietly. Daniel considered that. "Then nothing changes," he said honestly. "And that'll tell me something too." He offered her a business card. Simple, heavy, his name embossed, understated, dot. As he walked out, the remaining onlookers parted like water. No one touched him. No one stopped him. The bell over the door rang once, sharp and final. She stood there, long after he was gone. The diner smelled like grease and coffee and ozone, as if lightning really had struck. She looked down at her hands, still faintly stained, still smelling of coffee, and felt a strange, unsettling certainty settle into her bones, a single sentence, spoken without fear, and nothing would ever quite go back to the way it had been. The conference room overlooked a city she'd only ever seen on postcards, sleek skylines caught in golden hour light, impossible blue skies arching over glass and steel. From up here, the streets below looked orderly, almost gentle, as if the city were a carefully arranged model rather than a place that swallowed people whole. Cars slid along avenues like quiet thoughts. People were dots, indistinct and small. She stood just inside the door, hands clasped too tightly in front of her, aware of every sound her shoes made against the polished floor. The room smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and expensive coffee. Glass walls rose on three sides, transparent and unforgiving. Screens glowed with charts, maps, numbers that climbed and dipped in colors she didn't know how to read. Acronyms floated past her vision like a foreign language. She had dressed carefully, her best a blazer pressed the night before, a blouse chosen for neutrality rather than flair. Still, she felt exposed, as if the room could see through fabric and skin and stray into her doubts. Everyone else was already seated. Men and women in tailored suits, tablets open, pens aligned parallel to notepads. They looked comfortable here, as though the room had been built around them, she wondered, not for the first time that morning. How a wrong turn in her life had landed her here. The door opened again. Daniel entered without ceremony, carrying nothing but a slim folder tucked under one arm. He moved easily, as if the air itself parted for him. Conversations hushed, chairs shifted, a few people smiled in greeting, others straightened alert. He caught her eye immediately. "There you are," he said quietly, not unkindly. He gestured to an empty chair beside his own. "Sit with me." The invitation was small, almost casual, but it felt like a hand on her back, steadying. She crossed the room, heart beating hard, and took the seat. The leather was cool. Her feet barely reached the floor. Daniel looked around the table. "Before we start," he said, "there's someone I want you to hear from." He turned slightly toward her. "This is the woman I told you about," he said to the room. "Listen carefully." The words landed heavier than she expected, heads turned, eyes focused. The room, which had felt vast and echoing moments before, seemed to contract around her. They were listening. Her mouth went dry. She hadn't planned a speech. She had notes, somewhere in a bag, scribbled on lined paper that suddenly felt childish compared to the glowing tablets around her. For a heartbeat, she considered reaching for them. Instead, she folded her hands together and breathed. She thought of the counter, the chipped laminate surfaced, the hum of fluorescent lights, the way customers talked over her, through her, as if she were part of the furniture. She thought of policies handed down without explanation, of rules enforced without compassion, of the long line that formed every Monday morning, faces tight with worry, anger, shame. She lifted her gaze. "I'm not an expert," she began, and her voice did shake, just a little. "I don't speak in metrics or projections. I speak from the other side." A pause. No one interrupted her. "When you're standing at the counter," she continued, "power feels loud. It's a sign on the wall that says no. It's a form you filled out wrong, even though no one explained it. It's a deadline you missed because you had to choose between showing up here and showing up for your kid." Her hands loosened as she spoke. The words came easier now, carried by memory. "Fairness," she said, "isn't about treating everyone the same. It's about understanding what it costs people to comply. Dignity is being told why, not just being told no. It's being looked at when someone speaks to you. It's being seen as a person, not a problem to be processed." She glanced at the screens, the neat columns of data. "I know numbers matter, I know systems matter, but systems touch lives at their most fragile points. If you don't design them with that in mind, they will do harm, even when they work exactly as intended." Her voice steadied. Warmth crept in where fear had been. "I've seen what happens when people feel invisible. They stop trusting, they stop trying, and once that happens, no amount of efficiency can fix what's broken." Silence followed her. Last words not the awkward kind, but a deep, held quiet. The city beyond the glass seemed to pause with them. She became acutely aware of her breathing, of the faint hum of the building. Daniel nodded once as he said, calm and certain, "Is the culture we build." Something shifted. Questions followed, but they were different from what she had feared. Not challenges, curiosity. Someone asked about training frontline staff. Another about feedback loops, about accountability that went both ways. She answered, as best she could, honestly, as sometimes admitting when she didn't know. Each time Daniel listened without stepping in, without translating her words into corporate language. He didn't need to. They understood. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped back and conversations resumed in low, thoughtful tones. A woman in a gray suit approached her first. "Have you ever considered finishing your degree?" she asked. "We have programs of flexibility." A man with kind eyes followed. "We're expanding community outreach," he said. "We need voices like yours shaping it from the start." Others added their own pieces. Mentorship, training. A role that didn't yet have a title but carried weight. Often she felt dizzy, as if the floor had tilted beneath her. Just hours ago, she had worried about making rent, about whether she belonged anywhere beyond the counter. Now doors were opening she hadn't known existed. Daniel waited until the room had emptied before speaking again. "You did well," he said simply. "I was terrified," she admitted. He smiled. "Courage usually is." They stood together by the glass wall for a moment, looking out over the city. Up here, it still looked unreal, but different now, less distant. "I always thought power meant volume," she said, "that it had to dominate." Daniel shook his head. "Real power," he said, "listens first." She let that settle for the first time. She understood that power didn't have to shout. It could invite, it could make room. It could pull out a chair and say, "Sit here, your voice belongs at this table," and for the first time, she believed she might help decide what the table looked like. Months later, the diner bustled more than ever. The bell above the door barely had time to settle between rings. Boots tracked in dust from the construction site on the edge of town, the one that used to be an empty field where kids raced bikes and couples parked to watch the sunset. Now it held a half-finished community center with big windows and a sign that promised opening this fall. Mornings brought nurses in scrubs, teachers with canvas bags, and men in pressed shirts who still looked faintly surprised to be needed here. The air smelled like coffee and cinnamon and something fried that no one bothered to identify anymore. Laughter cut through the clatter of plates. Orders overlapped. Life, noisy and unashamed, up behind the counter. The plaque caught the lights. "Big up, it matters." It wasn't fancy, just brushed metal, bolted a little crooked because the wall stud hadn't been where they thought it was. But people noticed it, some nodded at it. Some touched it absent-mindedly while waiting to pay. A few asked about it, quietly, like they were asking permission. She always told the truth. She still wore an apron some mornings by choice, not because she had to, not because anyone expected her to, but because there was comfort in the weight of it, in the ritual of tying the strings behind her back, in the way muscle memory took over when the rush hit. She liked knowing she could still slide a plate onto the counter without spilling the gravy, still read a table from across the room and know who needed a refill before they asked. Some mornings she worked the register. Other days she flew, helping where help was needed. And some days she just sat in the back booth with a legal pad and a cup of coffee, reviewing schedules, meeting notes, grant proposals. The diner had become more than a diner, and she had become more than one thing. The first time she'd worn the apron again after everything, the room had gone quiet in a way that startled her. Forks paused mid-door, conversations dipped. Someone dropped a spoon, then Mrs. Alvarez had clapped. "Well," she said loudly, from her usual seat by the window. "It's about time." The room exhaled. Sound rushed back in. Someone laughed. Someone else called out an order. The moment passed stitched seamlessly into the fabric of the place. Daniel visited occasionally, or sitting in the same booth, third from the window, left side, back to the wall. It wasn't superstition, it was habit, and habit had gotten him through worse than discomfort. He ordered the same thing most days: eggs, over easy, wheat toast, coffee black. He tipped too much. He watched more than he talked out at first. His visits had been tentative. He'd lingered by the door like he might turn around, like the bell might accuse him of something. But no one did. The town had learned, in its uneven way, how to move forward without pretending. Nothing had happened. They didn't forget. They just didn't freeze. Daniel's hair had gone grayer at the temples, or maybe she'd just started noticing. He'd lost weight and then gained some back. His hands shook less than they used to, though that might have been the coffee. He waited, until he wasn't busy to speak to her always, as if he were afraid of taking up space he hadn't earned. "You ever regret it?" he asked one start. It was a slow afternoon, the rare kind where sunlight pulled lazily on the tabletops and the radio played something old and sweet. She was wiping down the counter, moving in small circles, the way she always did. She looked at him, really looked. Daniel's face held the question carefully, like something fragile, not demanding an answer, just offering the chance. She smiled, standing up. "No," he said, being shocked. She poured his coffee, steady hand, dark stream. "Best tip I ever gave myself." He laughed, then surprised. "A little rough around the edges." The sound startled him as much as it did her. "I don't think I ever thanked you," he said after a moment. She slid the mug toward him. "For what?" "For not making it easier for me." She leaned on the counter, saying, "You did the hard part yourself." "Still," he said, "you could have let it slide. People did, before." "I know. And now?" Yes, she glanced around the diner. The couple arguing softly over pancakes. The kid doing homework at the counter. The new hire fumbling with the coffee pot while someone patiently coached her through it. "Now we know better," she said. "That changes things." Daniel nodded slowly. "It does." When he left, he paused by the plaque, reading it again like it might have changed since last time. Then he stepped outside into the afternoon, where the town hummed with work and motion and the sound of something being built. Outside, the town thrived. Not perfectly, not without friction. But there were new businesses along Main Street, their windows still bare, signs temporary. The old hardware store had reopened under new ownership. The library had longer hours now. The high school added a counseling office. That wasn't just a converted closet with a folding chair. People said things out loud that they used to swallow, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes clumsily, but they said them. It had started small. 2 sentences. Spoken at the right moment. She remembered the feel of the floor under her shoes that day. The way her heart had slammed so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She remembered the shock literal and otherwise and the silence that followed, sharp as glass. She remembered thinking, if I don't say it now, I never will. That thought still visited her sometimes, late at night or early in the morning, when doubt crept in wearing familiar clothes. But now it came with something else. Proof. Proof looked like the new girl behind the counter, who had spoken up during her first week when a customer crossed the line and been backed up without hesitation. Proof looked like Daniel sitting in that booth, choosing accountability over disappearance. Proof looked like herself, apron on or off, knowing she belonged to every version of her life. On Fridays, the diner hosted open forums after closing. Anyone could come. Anyone could talk. Sometimes 5 people showed up. Sometimes 50. Sometimes the room filled with anger, or grief, or confusion that didn't resolve neatly. She learned to let silence breathe, learned that listening was not the same as agreeing, and that disagreement didn't have to be violence. One night, a teenage girl stood up, hands shaking, and said, I thought I was alone. The room leaned toward her like a single organism. You're not, someone said, then another, then another. The diner lights glowed late into the evening. Month later, people still asked her about that day. Did it hurt? Yes. Was she afraid, terrified? Would she do it again? Every time. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she'd said nothing. The town would have gone on, probably. The diner would have served breakfast. People would have laughed and gossiped and paid their tabs. But something essential would have remained untested. Now, when she locked up at night, she paused by the plaque, fingers brushing the cool metal, not as a reminder of pain, but of alignment of the moment her voice and her values had finally agreed. Outside, the town thrived, and it all started with 2 sentences spoken at the right moment. She turned off the lights, stepped into the evening air, and went home knowing this much. At least, speaking up hadn't changed everything, but it had changed enough, and sometimes that was how the world moved forward. One charged moment, one steady voice, one choice to stay standing.